The room was filled with tension as Amara stood near the doorway, her bag packed and slung over her shoulder. Her parents, Neka and Obi, sat on the worn chairs, their faces etched with worry and frustration. The conversation had grown heated, and the air felt heavy with unspoken fears. "Amara, you will not leave this house to chase foolish dreams." Obi's voice was firm, though his grip on his walking stick trembled slightly. "The city is no place for a young girl like you." "Papa, I'm not a child anymore," Amara replied, her voice rising with determination. "I can't stay in this town forever, selling vegetables and waiting for a miracle. There's nothing for me here." Neka wiped her eyes with the edge of her wrapper. "Amara, we may not have much, but at least you are safe here. The city is dangerous. You've heard the stories." "I've heard stories of success too," Amara countered. "I have dreams, Mama. I'm not afraid of hard work, and besides, I have my beauty. That will open doors for me." Obi sighed deeply and turned away, unable to meet her eyes. "Dreams don't fill your stomach, Amara. But if your mind is made up, who am I to stop you?" As the old bus rumbled down the dirt road, Amara boarded with mixed emotions. She glanced back to see Neka crying quietly and Obi staring into the distance, his expression unreadable. Doubts gnawed at her, but she pushed them aside. This was her chance to make something of herself. The bus jolted forward, and Amara held onto the seat in front of her. The sun blazed above, but the horizon ahead was uncertain. Would the city bring her dreams to life, or would it destroy her? Only time would tell. The moment Amara stepped off the bus, she was hit by a wave of noise and chaos. The bustling city was a world away from her quiet small town. Cars honked incessantly, people shouted over each other, and the air carried a mix of exhaust fumes and fried street food. Amara clutched her bag tightly and looked around. Towering buildings loomed overhead, casting long shadows on the crowded streets. This was the city of dreams she had imagined, but it felt far less welcoming than she had hoped. Her first priority was finding a place to stay. She approached a group of women selling fruits by the roadside and asked for directions to a cheap lodge. After several confusing explanations, she finally found a dingy guest house tucked away in a narrow alley. The room was small and smelled of mildew, but it was all she could afford. The next day, Amara set out to look for work. She walked from shop to shop, her dress growing damp with sweat, as she faced rejection after rejection. Shopkeepers dismissed her with a shake of their heads, and office clerks barely glanced at her before sending her away. By evening, her feet ached, and her stomach growled from hunger. She sat on a bench by the roadside, watching the city lights flicker to life. Doubts began to creep in as she stared into the distance. Was this truly the path to her dreams, or had she made a terrible mistake? As darkness fell, Amara returned to her guest house, her spirits low but her resolve unbroken. "Tomorrow will be better," she whispered to herself, though deep down, uncertainty lingered like a shadow. The following morning, Amara rose early and ventured into the bustling streets once more. She couldn't afford another day without work. Her stomach rumbled, but she ignored the hunger and focused on the task at hand. Determined, she approached a row of shops asking if they needed help. The rejections piled up quickly. By mid-afternoon, Amara's stomach growled with hunger, but her little money made her hesitate. She paused at a roadside vendor roasting corn, the smell too tempting to resist. After counting her remaining money, she bought one cob, eating it slowly to ease her hunger. The small meal gave her strength. "I can't give up now," she said to herself, standing up with renewed energy. She resumed her search for work, going from shop to shop. By evening, her persistence paid off. A provision store owner offered her a salesgirl job. The pay was small, but it was enough to cover some basic needs. Grateful for the opportunity, Amara saw it as a step forward in her struggle to survive. As she returned to her guest house, Amara reflected on the day. The city had tested her resolve, but she had survived. "Things will surely get better," she whispered to herself, clinging to a fragile sense of hope. Amara's days began to follow a routine. She worked hard at the provision store, but the pay barely covered her basic needs. Each night she collapsed into bed, her body aching but her spirit unbroken. One afternoon, as she was arranging goods at the stall, a young woman walked in to buy some provisions. She was a few years older than Amara, dressed in a stylish blouse and fitted trousers. Her confidence was palpable, and she carried herself with an air of sophistication that caught Amara's attention. "You work here?" the woman asked, her tone curious but friendly. Amara nodded. "Yes, ma, just trying to make ends meet." The woman smiled. "I'm Ngozi, and you are?" "Amara," she replied hesitantly. Ngozi tilted her head, studying her. "You're a beautiful girl, Amara. I can see you don't belong in a place like this." Amara frowned slightly. "It's honest work," she said defensively. "I didn't mean any offence," Ngozi said, her smile never wavering. "I'm just saying there's more out there for someone like you. Have you ever thought about making money using your looks?" Amara's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" Ngozi leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Let's just say there are men out there who would pay handsomely for your company. You wouldn't have to struggle like this. Think about it." She handed Amara a piece of paper with a phone number scrawled on it. "If you ever want to know more, call me. No pressure." Amara stared at the piece of paper as Ngozi walked away, her heels clicking against the floor. The promise of an easier life was tempting, but it felt like a dangerous path. As she tucked the paper into her pocket, she resolved to push the thought aside. Yet, Ngozi's words lingered, planting a seed of doubt and curiosity that refused to go away. Amara sat on her small bed, the card Ngozi had given her resting in her hand. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of traffic outside. For days she had resisted calling the number, but the whispers of her struggles grew louder in her mind. Her stomach grumbled, and her savings were almost gone. The thought of returning home as a failure filled her with dread. "Just one call," she whispered to herself. "No harm in asking questions." Her fingers trembled as she dialed the number. Ngozi answered almost immediately, her voice warm and reassuring. "I knew you'd call," she said, as if she had been expecting this moment. They agreed to meet the next day at a small joint near the city centre. The following evening, Amara found herself seated across from Ngozi at the small joint. Ngozi exuded confidence, her makeup flawless, and her demeanour calm. "I know this isn't an easy decision," Ngozi began, sipping her drink. "But I promise you, this isn't as bad as it seems. You set your boundaries and you only do what you're comfortable with." Amara listened intently, her doubts battling with the allure of an easier life. Ngozi explained how she started, sharing stories of luxurious gifts and financial freedom. "It's not forever," she added, "just enough to get you on your feet." That evening, Amara sat on the edge of her bed deep in thought. The weight of her decision pressed down on her. Finally, she resolved to try, convincing herself it was temporary. After all, hadn't she come to the city to change her life? Amara's entry into her new lifestyle was hesitant at first. Ngozi guided her, introducing her to potential clients and offering advice. "Always stay in control," Ngozi said firmly. "Remember, this is just a stepping stone." At first, Amara struggled to reconcile her choices with her conscience. The money, however, was undeniable. Her dingy house was replaced by a neat apartment, and she no longer worried about where her next meal would come from. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of relief. But the guilt lingered. Each night, as she counted the money she earned, a small voice in her head questioned whether this was worth the cost of her dignity. One day, Amara realized she hadn't had her period in weeks. Panic set in as she purchased a pregnancy test from a nearby pharmacy. The result was positive. Her hands shook as she stared at the test. "No," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "This can't be happening." Amara tried to think logically. She went through the names of the men she had been with, but the list made her stomach churn. There was no way to know who the father was. Desperate, she called Ngozi. When they met, Amara blurted out the news. Ngozi's calm demeanour faltered for a moment before she placed a hand on Amara's shoulder. "We'll figure this out," she said. though her tone lacked its usual confidence. Amara tried to pin the pregnancy on one of her wealthiest clients, but he dismissed her outright. "That's not my problem," he said coldly, leaving her feeling even more alone. As the days passed, Amara's options seemed to dwindle. She contemplated terminating the pregnancy, but was told by a doctor that it was too late. She was trapped, and for the first time, the reality of her choices hit her like a tidal wave. She sat in her apartment, tears streaming down her face as she placed a hand on her stomach. "What am I going to do?" she whispered into the empty room, the weight of her situation pressing down on her. The days blurred into each other as Amara grappled with her new reality. Her once carefully managed life had spiraled into chaos. The pregnancy grew harder to conceal, and her ability to keep working diminished. Clients began to notice her changes and became less interested. Even Ngozi, who had always been reassuring, seemed unsure of what advice to offer now. "Amara, you need to take a break," Ngozi suggested one afternoon as they sat in Amara's small apartment. "This stress isn't good for you or the baby." "How am I supposed to survive if I stop working?" Amara snapped, tears brimming in her eyes. "I have no one. I can't go home. I can't do this alone." Ngozi hesitated, biting her lip as if she wanted to say more but stopped herself. "You're not alone," she finally said, "but we need to figure out another way." Despite her friend's words, Amara felt utterly isolated. The doctor's words echoed in her mind. Terminating the pregnancy was no longer an option. She had no choice but to carry the baby to term, whether she was ready or not. One sleepless night, as the city buzzed outside her window, Amara stared at the shadows dancing on her ceiling. Fear gripped her heart. The money she had saved was running out, and the whispers of shame and regret grew louder in her mind. Ngozi's words lingered. "We'll figure this out." But even that promise felt hollow now. Amara was trapped, waiting for the storm to fully break. Months passed, and Amara's pregnancy became undeniable. The day finally arrived, marked by sharp pain that struck her in the middle of the night. Alone in her dimly lit apartment, Amara clutched her stomach and tried to steady her breathing. Panic surged as the contractions grew stronger. She had no one to call except Ngozi. Ngozi arrived as quickly as she could, her face pale with worry. Together, they rushed to a small clinic in the heart of the city. The nurses moved efficiently, and soon Amara was in the delivery room, fighting through the pain. Hours felt like an eternity, but finally, the cries of a newborn pierced the air. Then, to everyone's surprise, another cry followed, and another. Amara's heart stopped as the nurse placed not one, but 3 tiny babies in her arms. "Triplets," the nurse said with a small smile. "Congratulations." Amara's exhaustion was replaced by a flood of emotions, shock, joy, and an overwhelming sense of fear. Triplets. How would she care for 3 babies when she could barely support herself? Ngozi peered at the tiny bundles in Amara's arms, her expression a mixture of awe and concern. "Amara," she began softly, "we'll figure this out. But this changes everything." Back at her apartment, the reality of her situation began to sink in. The cries of the babies filled the small space, and Amara's exhaustion deepened with each passing day. Feeding 3 mouths, changing 3 sets of diapers, and trying to soothe their cries felt like an impossible task. Her savings vanished quickly, and the weight of her decision to come to the city bore down on her like never before. As she stared at her sleeping babies one evening, tears streamed down her face. "I love you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But what am I going to do?" The days turned into weeks, and Amara's struggles only grew. The triplets cried constantly, their needs overwhelming her every moment. Sleep became a luxury she could no longer afford, and her health began to deteriorate under the unrelenting pressure. Ngozi visited more often, bringing small supplies and offering moral support, but even she could see the toll motherhood was taking on Amara. One evening, as the two sat in the dimly lit apartment, Ngozi spoke carefully. "Amara, I've been thinking about something," she began, her voice hesitant. "There's a way out of this, a way to give you and the babies a better life." Amara frowned, her exhaustion mingling with confusion. What do you mean? Ngozi hesitated, then took a deep breath. I know someone, a couple. They've been looking to adopt children, and they're willing to pay a lot of money. The words hung heavy in the air. Amara's heart raced as she tried to process what Ngozi was saying. You're asking me to sell my babies? Ngozi reached for her hand, her expression earnest. Amara, listen to me. You're drowning. You can't do this alone, and this couple can give your children a life you can't right now. Think about it. They'll be well cared for, and you'll have the means to start over. Amara pulled her hand away, tears streaming down her face. How can you even suggest that? They're my children. Ngozi's voice softened. I know. And I wouldn't suggest it if I didn't think it was the only way. Just think about it, okay? You don't have to decide now. That night, Amara sat alone, the weight of Ngozi's words pressing down on her. She looked at her sleeping babies, their tiny faces peaceful and innocent. The thought of giving them up felt unbearable, but the desperation in her heart whispered that she might not have a choice. The following days were a haze of sleepless nights and overwhelming need. Amara could no longer ignore the mounting desperation. Her meagre savings had vanished completely, and the triplets' cries pierced her heart every time she realized she couldn't provide for them. Ngozi's suggestion replayed in her mind, taunting her with its dark simplicity. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ngozi returned. She brought formula and diapers, but her face carried a quiet determination. Amara, have you thought about what we discussed? Amara hesitated, her hands trembling. I don't know, Ngozi. How can I even consider it? They're my children. Ngozi sighed, placing a gentle hand on her friend's shoulder. I know it feels impossible, but think of what's best for them. Right now, you're barely surviving. This isn't just about you, it's about their future too. This couple can give them a life you can't. Tears streamed down Amara's face as she looked at her babies. Their small hands grasped at the air, their cries softening as she rocked them. She knew Ngozi was right. Her love wasn't enough to shield them from the harsh realities they faced. I need more time, Amara whispered, her voice breaking. Ngozi nodded. Take the night, but Amara, if you want to go through with this, the couple is ready. The longer you wait, the harder this will be. As the door closed behind Ngozi, Amara sat on the floor, cradling her triplets. The weight of her decision crushed her. Hours passed as she wrestled with her emotions. When dawn broke, the pale light streaming through the window, Amara knew she couldn't delay any longer. By evening, she had made her decision. With trembling hands, she called Ngozi. Her voice was barely audible. Let's do it. Ngozi arrived within the hour, her demeanor calm, but her eyes betraying a hint of sadness. Together they packed the baby's belongings, each item feeling like a piece of Amara's soul being stripped away. The couple arrived shortly after, their polished appearance and warm smiles a stark contrast to the somber atmosphere of Amara's apartment. As the babies were placed into their new parents' arms, Amara felt an emptiness she couldn't describe. The transaction was quick, and the couple handed her a substantial suitcase filled with money before leaving with the triplets. When the door closed, Amara sank to the floor, her hands trembling as she stared into nothingness. Tears streamed down her face, but the cries of her babies no longer filled the air. The silence was unbearable. The suitcase sat in the corner of Amara's now silent apartment, its presence both a reminder of her sacrifice and a glimmer of hope. The emptiness left by her babies was unbearable, but the money gave her a chance to start anew. Slowly, Amara forced herself to rise from the ashes of her former life. The first step was finding a better apartment. With the money, she moved to a cleaner, more respectable neighborhood. She bought new clothes, ones that didn't carry the stains of her struggles. Determined to leave her old life behind, Amara enrolled in a short business course, learning the basics of running a trade. Weeks turned into months, and Amara used part of the money to open a small but thriving shop in the heart of the city. She sold household goods, her shelves always stocked, and her demeanor welcoming. Customers began to trust her, and word of her honesty spread. For the first time, Amara felt a sense of purpose that didn't rely on her beauty or the whims of others. But at night, the weight of her decision haunted her. The silence of her apartment was deafening, and dreams of her triplets often woke her in tears. She convinced herself that they were better off, that she had given them a chance at a life she couldn't provide. One evening, as she closed up her shop, a well-dressed man lingered near the entrance. He smiled warmly when their eyes met. "Good evening," he said, his voice rich and confident. "I've been watching this shop grow. You're doing something remarkable here." Amara nodded politely, unsure of his intentions. "Thank you." "I'm Ikenna," he said, extending a hand. "And I'd like to get to know the woman behind this success." Amara hesitated but found herself smiling. Perhaps, she thought, this was the beginning of another chapter in her life, one where she could finally find happiness, or at least redemption. Ikenna became a regular visitor at Amara's shop. Each evening, as the city buzzed around them, he would linger near the counter, buying small items just for an excuse to talk. His warmth and charm slowly chipped away at the wall Amara had built around her heart. At first, she kept him at a distance, cautious and guarded. Her past loomed large, a secret she was determined to keep buried, but Ikenna was persistent, his genuine interest and kindness wearing down her defences. One evening, as they stood outside the shop under the fading glow of streetlights, Ikenna turned to her with a smile. "Amara, you're incredible, the strength it must have taken to build all this." "I'm amazed." Amara looked away, her heart heavy with unspoken truths. "It wasn't easy," she admitted, "but we all have to survive." "I'd like to know you better," he said gently. "Not just the businesswoman, but the woman behind it all." Amara hesitated, fear tightening her chest. But there was something in Ikenna's eyes, genuine care, without judgment. Against her better judgment, she agreed to dinner. As weeks turned into months, their relationship blossomed. Ikenna's presence brought a sense of stability Amara hadn't felt in years. He was successful, caring, and deeply devoted to her, qualities she hadn't dared to hope for. But as her feelings for him deepened, so did her fear. She knew that her past, if revealed, could destroy everything. For now, she chose to live in the moment, savouring the happiness she had found. Little did she know, the shadows of her decisions were already beginning to stir. Amara's life seemed to take a dreamlike turn. Ikenna proposed marriage after only a year of courting her. It was an intimate moment, under the soft glow of candlelight during a private dinner. The diamond ring he slid onto her finger sparkled like her hopes for a brighter future. "You've changed my life, Amara," Ikenna said, his voice filled with emotion. "I want to spend every day proving how much you mean to me." Overwhelmed with joy, Amara accepted. Their wedding was a grand affair, attended by Ikenna's wealthy family and friends. Amara felt out of place at times, but Ikenna's unwavering attention kept her grounded. For once, she believed she could leave her past behind. Their marriage started blissfully. Ikenna adored her, showering her with love and support. Amara embraced her role as his wife and worked hard to maintain the illusion of perfection. She kept her past buried deep, terrified of what would happen if he found out the truth. But the illusion began to crack when Ikenna's family started asking questions about children. At every family gathering, his mother, Nkem, made subtle remarks about the need for an heir. "A man as successful as Ikenna needs a son to carry on his legacy," Nkem said pointedly during one dinner. Amara's smile faltered, but she nodded politely, not daring to speak. Months turned into years, and no children came. The pressure from Ikenna's family grew unbearable. Doctors assured them there were no medical issues, which only deepened the mystery. Amara felt the weight of her secret growing heavier with each passing day. "It's not your fault, Amara," Ikenna said one evening, holding her close. "We'll keep trying. I love you, no matter what." But his words couldn't soothe the storm brewing in her heart. She knew the truth would eventually come to light, and when it did, it could shatter everything she had built. The whispers in Ikena's family grew louder as months turned into years. Amara endured their judgmental stares and sharp comments with a forced smile, but the tension at home became unbearable. Ikena continued to defend her, but even he was beginning to look weary. "I don't understand it, Amara," he said one evening, his voice tinged with frustration. "The doctors say everything is fine. Why is this happening to us?" Amara swallowed hard, her guilt swelling inside her like a tidal wave. She avoided his gaze and mumbled, "I don't know." The breaking point came when Nkem called a family meeting. "This isn't normal," she declared, her voice stern. "If Amara cannot give us grandchildren, maybe it's time to consider other options." Amara's heart sank. "Other options?" she echoed, her voice barely audible. "Another wife," Nkem said bluntly. The words struck like a dagger, and Amara felt the room spinning. Ikena rose to his feet, his face etched with anger. "Enough, Mama," he snapped. "This is my marriage, not yours." But even his defense couldn't erase the damage. That night, Amara cried silently, the weight of her secret crushing her. She couldn't let this continue. Something had to be done. The next day, a mutual acquaintance visited their home. She was a soft-spoken woman named Adaku. "Ikena Amara," she began, her tone gentle but firm. "I've heard of your struggles, and I believe I know someone who can help." Amara tensed. "A spiritual healer?" she asked, her voice trembling. Adaku nodded. "Sometimes the answers we seek aren't in science. This healer is renowned. People come from far and wide for his wisdom." Desperate, Ikena agreed, and Amara felt the walls closing in around her. They visited the healer the following week, a stooped old man with piercing eyes. As he listened to their story, his expression darkened. "The issue isn't physical," he said finally, his voice heavy with foreboding. "This is a spiritual matter, tied to something from the past." Amara's blood ran cold. The healer's gaze fixed on her, unblinking. "The answer lies with you," he said gravely, "and the cost of fixing this will not be small." The room fell silent, and Amara's heart pounded in her chest. She knew without a doubt that her past had finally caught up with her. Amara and Ikena sat across from the healer, the weight of his words hanging in the dimly lit room. The healer's piercing gaze didn't waver, and Amara felt as though he could see into her very soul. "What do you mean?" Ikena asked, his voice tense. "What kind of cost?" The healer's expression grew grim. "There are debts that must be paid," he said, his tone deliberate. "Spirits remember what we try to forget. To restore balance, the truth must be confronted, and a great sacrifice must be made." Amara's heart raced. Her palms were clammy, and her throat felt dry. What do I need to do?" she stammered, though deep down she already knew the answer. The healer pointed to her with a bony finger. "Only you know the wrongs you must set right. The spirits will not allow new life until the past is acknowledged and atoned for. Without this, there will be no children. And if you delay further, greater suffering will come." Ikena turned to Amara, confusion etched on his face. "What is he talking about?" he demanded. "What past? What is he saying?" Amara couldn't meet his eyes. The walls seemed to close in on her, and her vision blurred with tears. She had spent years burying her past, convincing herself that she could escape it. But now it stood before her, demanding to be reckoned with. The healer stood, signaling that their time was up. "The spirits have spoken," he said simply. "The choice is yours." As they left the healer's home, the silence between Amara and Ikena was suffocating. Back at their house, Ikena finally broke. "Amara, tell me the truth," he said, his voice filled with both anger and desperation. "What is it that you're hiding?" Amara trembled, her body racked with sobs. She knew there was no escaping now. The cliff she had been teetering on for years had finally crumbled beneath her feet. "Ikena," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "there's something you need to know."